Hi friends. Are you one of those people that lives by that I will be happy when phenomenon? That kind of feeling that you're always chasing something and that there's some type of goal in your mind in which once you reach that goal, you think that's when I'll be content. That's when, I'll really be living life. So if you have the sensation and you have a lot of days in which you feel kind of not your best. Maybe you feel kind of low. Maybe you feel agitated. Maybe you just feel really dissatisfied with your life. Then this is the video for you, because in this video, you will learn how to shift your thinking into a different state so that you can feel better now whenever you want. Like, you don't have to wait for some magical goal to be achieved. You can feel better now whenever you need to feel better. Because honestly, some days you just don't feel great. So first of all, we're going to talk about my favorite neuromodulator, dopamine. When most people think dopamine, they think of pleasure because we often associate dopamine with drugs. But in actuality, dopamine is instrumental in helping us maximize all of our future resources. Meaning that dopamine, its main purpose is for us to think of something that we don't have and to strive to get it. And that's where dopamine comes in. It is the neuromodulator that allows us to partake in this striving. And dopamine is often associated for this reason with higher energy, motivation, excitement, confidence. But at the same time, dopamine is also associated with dissatisfaction, unhappiness, misery, and constantly chasing something that we can never quite capture. And so it essentially has this kind of light side and dark side. And although, like most things in life, there are good things to it, there's also this dark side that's often not talked about unless we're talking about dopamine and drugs. One thing to understand about dopamine is that it very much functions based on your extra-personal space. So this is an important distinction to understand. There's two conceptualizations in psychology. There is the peripersonal space and there is the extrapersonal space. And so the peripersonal space is anything that you own, anything you have control over, anything that's kind of within your current kind of grasping distance, something that you can actually interact with. And dopamine shuts off during this mindset, during this perception. So if I look at my very messy desk and I look at all of the things that are on here and I really focus on them, then my dopamine will actually shut off because I'm just looking at all this stuff I have. But if I start thinking about, ooh, this desk is very messy, I wish I could have a desk that was much cleaner, then that would actually be dopaminergic because I'm thinking of something I don't have. And that is the extra-personal space. The extra-personal space is anything outside of your personal space. It is the thing you don't have, the thing you want to work toward. Your interaction with this space is always in the future. It's something that you need to work to create in the future, just like I would need to work to create a clean desk, which I obviously have not been motivated to do so. But this desk example is a perfect kind of example of this difference between peripersonal space and extrapersonal space in relation to our mood. So when I think about my desk and I think like, oh, I should have a clean desk, there's a layer of judgment there, and at the same time there is a layer of time perception. So there is kind of looking at my current state of my desk and then thinking about it in the future, in which in my mind's eye I'm imagining a clean desk. And honestly, that kind of makes me feel stressed and a little bit bad about my desk. And this is exactly why the neuromodulator dopamine is a little bit of an issue when it comes to our moods and our feeling content with our current states and our current lives. And this is also why so many of us feel that agitated feeling that nothing is ever quite enough. Because when it comes to dopamine, I really like what Daniel Lieberman talks about in his book, The Dopamine, the Molecule of More, which is super interesting, and I highly recommend it as a read if you're interested in this topic. I will link it below. And so what he often says is the guy who can most afford the beach house is not the guy that can really enjoy it. And here, please insert gender neutral pronoun if you would like to do so. This is just how he says it. And so the idea behind this is that the person who is able to work really, really, really hard to accomplish a big goal is so dopaminergic that they will not be the person that knows how to look in their peripersonal space and be like, yeah, this is a nice beach house. This is good. I like this. Because they will always, always, always be in that extra personal space. They will always be looking at the things that they do not have, because that is what allowed them to have the big expensive things in the first place. And so it's this kind of catch-22, which we often see in very wealthy people or celebrities, in which they have so much, but at the same time, they seem to not quite be able to enjoy it. They seem to have a lot of interpersonal struggles and even mental health issues. And this is the exact reason why this happens. So what can we do about it? So obviously the title of this video is how to feel better now. And you're like, well, like, how you haven't spoken how to do that. Like, how do I actually feel better now? All you're talking about is how dopamine works. Okay, so we're getting to that. In Daniel Lieberman's book about dopamine, he actually talks about the kind of opposite state of the dopaminergic state, which he calls the here and now state. And in the here and now state, various hormones and neuromodulators are released, such as oxytocin, serotonin, endocannabinoids, which allow us to feel good in the moment. And he calls those here and now chemicals. And these here and now chemicals are associated with enjoying things in this current moment, enjoying the things that we have. So dopamine actually has another issue, and you might have learned about this in my other dopamine video that talks about how dopamine essentially functions on a seesaw type mechanism in our brains, in that it needs to modulate itself by rising and falling. And so essentially this results in kind of that saying in whatever goes up must come down. So the higher the dopamine rises, the lower it will fall, and that's how it modulates itself. So the higher the highs, the lower the lows. And one way that we can really view this is when it comes to drugs. So we know that with drugs, they create super biological doses of dopamine in our minds, in our brains. And what happens with this is that because things like cocaine or nicotine can create such high highs that they're somewhat unnatural, they also create extremely low lows. And that extremely low low is actually the reason why people get addicted. This is a common misconception. People often think that addicts are chasing the highs, but in actuality, what happens is that the low is so miserable, it is so painful that the addict will do anything to get out of that pain, which usually is taking more drugs. Okay, so now that you understand this and you kind of understand the problematic nature of living in a dopaminergic state, you might ask, like, why are we so dopaminergic? Like, what's going on here? Well, it's not always like this. We know that humans don't always need to function like this, and that dopamine actually isn't like this super important neuromodulator. There's so many other neurochemicals and hormones that impact our brains that could be driving our kind of view of the world. But what happens is that we've essentially created a culture of being very dopaminergically centered in the industrialized Western world. And what has happened is that most of us are very much viewing our lives and the world through this lens. And we don't even really quite realize that we can live a different way. We don't have to be like this. And it creates a lot of unrest, a lot of agitation, and a lot of unhappiness. But it is really, really good for anyone who's doing marketing, because if you always live in this state of never having enough, then it's really easy to sell things, and that can kind of explain why maybe we've created this cultural model of living in a dopaminergic state. That sounds like an idea for another video, so back to feeling better now. Okay, so when it comes down to it, dopamine can't really exist without you projecting into the future or the past. And so oftentimes dopamine is most associated with the future. We think like, okay, I'm going to create all of the things that I don't have, all of the goals that I want to strive for, and that's dopamine. Whenever you're thinking of the future, that's all dopamine. And oftentimes so many of us spend so much time living in the future. We're projecting kind of like, we're like creating like these movies of all the scenarios that are happening in the future, of all the ways that things could go wrong in our pursuit to our goals, etc., etc. Another way that we engage in a dopaminergic system is we think of the past in the context of things that we wish we still had. So we kind of think in the past, we're like, oh, that was really great. I wish I could do that again. And so this kind of wishing is also the idea of wanting to create something else in the future. So that's kind of like a sneaky way that we do that as well. And so without projecting into the past or the future, we really wouldn't be able to create that dopaminergic state. And that's why I'm guessing Daniel Lieberman named his non-dopaminergic state chemicals the here and now chemicals, is because once we are here and now, we are not in a dopaminergic state. We are in that oxytocin, serotonergic, neurocannabinoid kind of state that makes us feel really pleasant, and it makes us feel very content in this moment. And this is what we need to create when we don't feel great, like when we feel agitated, when we feel maybe somewhat depressed, maybe we feel it's just never quite enough. Because shifting into this here and now state is what allows us to recuperate from that constant drive of never enough, never enough, never enough. And we really need to shift into this here and now state to create that recuperation because our brains actually need it. And so you might be thinking, okay, that sounds great. Like I'll shift into the here and now state a couple times a day and I'll feel better, right? Well, you're going to have to do it probably a lot more than you think. And so some of this is kind of anecdata, which is essentially using anecdotes for data, which is not highly scientific, but some of this does have research behind it. So first of all, you're probably thinking like, how much time should I be spending in the here and now, in the present, versus in the future or the past in my head, in my thoughts? And so I actually like to suggest the framework of spending 70% of your time in the here and now and 30% in the past or future. And I know that probably sounds like a lot, but I think that is maybe the optimal framework to aim for in my personal experience and in my interpretation of the data. So in the NUN study, which is a famous psychological study that I'll link below, researchers found that nuns who had a ratio of positive to negative emotions in their diaries of 2.5 to 1 lived much longer and much happier lives than nuns who had lower ratios. And when it comes to relationships, the Gottman Institute found that a ratio of 5 to 1 positive to negative emotions and interactions was the optimal ratio for flourishing relationships. We're looking at 2.5 to 1 versus 5 to 1 ratios here, and that's quite a bit. Those are high ratios of kind of what we would consider helpful thoughts or helpful emotions versus harmful. And so this is kind of like a guideline for a ratio here. And obviously there's a lot of individuality in this. Oftentimes in science, everything is somewhat individual. So I would really encourage you to kind of see like, okay, maybe one day when you're feeling not so great, if you spent more time in the present, more time in the here and now, how would that increase or decrease your state of well-being? And kind of run those experiments on yourself and see what the optimal ratio is for you. Because remember, in research, everything is an aggregate, everything is an average. So maybe you would have a kind of lower ratio, or maybe you would have a higher ratio for optimal flourishing and functioning. Okay, and I just want to offer a couple of tips on how to engage in this kind of here and now mindset, because I do think that it is somewhat unnatural for most of us. It's kind of like we hear a lot of people talking about the present moment and we're like, yes, I agree, that sounds great. But then like you don't really know how to do it. And so one way that I think is really helpful to conceptualize the present moment and the here and now is to consider that it is really important to engage in this moment without any judgment. So once you start judging your current state, your current kind of experience, then you're not really in the current here and now anymore, because you've essentially started judging it probably from a framework of the future. So if you are able to kind of catch yourself judging and kind of shift back to not judging, that will be a good practice. And it does take time and effort to kind of master, just like everything in psychology. Sorry, it's not very instant, but this is a helpful way to kind of engage with this practice. Another way that you can engage with the present moment is something I've heard Eckhart Tolle say, is to think in your mind whenever you're trying to kind of enter this present moment, to think, thank you for this moment, I have no complaints. And that again relates to that non-judging aspect, in which it's important to kind of be here and now without judging the moment, without kind of striving to change it, which again is dopaminergic. All right, I hope this was helpful, and the book that I mentioned earlier was called The Molecule of More. I will link that below, and I will see you all next week with another video.